This week we're looking at Chapter 13, The Nature of the New Religious Movements, Anti-Cult Culture War in Microcosm, The Church of Scientology versus the Cult Awareness Network by Anson Shupe. He was an American sociologist who, according to Wikipedia, was noted for his studies of religious groups and their counter-movements, family violence, and clergy misconduct. He also was associated with the old and new Cult Awareness Network, which we will talk about, including acting as an expert witness for Scientology in their famous case that ended up destroying the old Cult Awareness Network, and even writing pro-cult literature for Scientology in their own publications. In other words, this guy was quite literally one of the very worst of the cult apologists. According to the Encyclopedia of Religion and Society, Shupe was the one who contributed a number of concepts that have acted as ammunition for Scientology to deride its critics, such as terms like apostate and anti-cultism. And he worked with other destructive cult apologists to create a framework of justification for their practices and existence, most notably David Bromley. You may recall that Bromley was the author of Chapter 4 of this book, and I did not have very many good things to say about his apologetics nonsense either. Bromley was one of those other pro-Scientology academics for hire, but he sort of burned that bridge when he described the whole Xenu narrative in his essay in this book. Shupe died in May 2015. I can't speak to his other work, but if this article is representative of how and what he wrote, you'll see why I have nothing but contempt for him professionally. I don't know what he was like personally, and I don't care. I'm not here to deride the man as an individual. This is a takedown of his professional academic work, not him as a human being. He begins by framing what he refers to as a culture war between destructive cults and those who wanted to help free their family and friends from such groups, which he refers to as the anti-cult movement, or ACM. Here's how he begins. During the 1980s and 1990s, evangelical Christians wrote books, articles, and editorial columns in such magazines as Christianity Today, proclaiming their conservative theologies, lifestyles, and values under attack by a hostile alliance of liberal Christians, agnostics, atheists, hedonists, radical feminists, pro-abortionists, and others. They referred to the presumed struggle between themselves, the forces of godliness, and the proponents of a secular America, presumably the forces of darkness, as a culture war. Meanwhile, however, there was a parallel culture war that had started earlier, during the mid-1960s. Its protagonists were unconventional new religious movements, hereafter NRMs. Some Christian-based, such as the Unification Church and the Children of God, now the Family. Some of foreign origin, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or Hare Krishnas and the Divine Light Mission. And some more like New Age psychotechnologies, such as EST. In particular was one that has endured longer and larger than most, the Church of Scientology International. Note that he immediately shows his bias by naming the new religious movements as the protagonists in this battle. In other words, he's positioning them as the good guys. By definition, a protagonist is an advocate or champion of a particular cause or idea. And as Shupe saw things, these new religious movements had to be defended in the name of religious freedom. Having taken this position, he then names the antagonists, in other words, the bad guys, as those who were struggling to oppose these destructive cults. The antagonists in this other culture war were family-based grassroots groups with emotive names such as Love Our Children, Inc., Citizens Engaged in Freeing Minds, the American Family Foundation, and the Citizens Freedom Foundation. They were all dedicated to 1. Rallying official and popular support for repressing NRMs they referred to as destructive cults, and 2. Seeking extraction of their loved ones, some minors, some legal adults, from NRMs, sometimes forcibly, employing a controversial abduction shock tactic they termed deprogramming. Together, these two groups constituted what has been termed the anti-cult movement, hereafter the ACM. One long-lasting group in the ACM, ultimately the largest and most influential on both national, U.S., and international levels, was the Cult Awareness Network, hereafter CAN, headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. Here is where Shupe introduces deprogramming, which is the big baseball bat he has to wield against CAN and any group who opposed new religious movements. He swings this bat again and again throughout this paper. Let's talk about this for a second, because it's something I've never really talked much about, and I think it's time to do so. Deprogramming refers to coercive measures to force a person in a controversial belief system to change those beliefs and abandon allegiance to the religious, political, economic, or social group associated with the belief system. Methods and practices of self-identified deprogrammers have involved kidnapping, false imprisonment, and coercion, and sometimes resulted in criminal convictions of the deprogrammers. Classic deprogramming regimens are designed for individuals taken against their will, which has led to controversies over freedom of religion, kidnapping, and civil rights, as well as the violence which is sometimes involved. All right, I want to state that I am, and always have been, unequivocally against deprogramming, or any similar tactic for handling someone in a destructive cult, or any situation for that matter. I've said time and again on this channel from the first day I started it that tolerance, understanding, rationality, and reason are the ways that you can change hearts and minds. You can beat or torture someone until they say what you want them to say, but that is not how you are ever going to get a lasting or positive change. And violence is something I do not support in any way. So, with it being clearly understood that there is nothing positive or advantageous or good in using deprogramming, it is not fair or accurate to paint everyone who opposes destructive cults as advocates for deprogramming. It is not accurate to claim that because deprogramming occurred, that it's wrong to oppose destructive cults and what they do. I'm not going to apologize for, justify, or excuse any instance of coercive and violent measures used to try to break someone out of a cult mentality. But I'm also not going to pretend that because a very few people let themselves get out of hand, that destructive cults now get a pass for every bad and criminal activity they've engaged in. Two wrongs don't make a right. The litany of crimes the Church of Scientology has committed, actual illegal activities for which people could go to jail, is a very long list, and is much more recent than the Snow White program debacle from the 1970s. This territory is well documented all the way up to the present, as some of you may have seen in Leah Remini's recent show, Scientology and the Aftermath, on A&E. In fact, let's be clear about something on this. One could argue that deprogramming of a sort is what destructive cults themselves do to their own members. I certainly could describe in detail how physical and mental abuse was used to change my mind when I was in the Sea Organization, especially during the 3-year period that I was kept sequestered from my wife, friends, and family doing the Rehabilitation Project Force. I have personal experience with how physical and psychological torment can very definitely change you for the worse, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But that didn't happen to me because someone was trying to get me out of a cult. It happened to me when I was in a destructive cult, in order to re-educate me so I would toe the line, follow orders, and be a good, compliant little Sea Org member. I'm not alone in having experienced this, as there are many others who have spoken out about it, and their stories are shocking and even horrifying. And I could go on in detail about other similar tactics in Scientology, such as Type 3 watches and the introspection rundown. which resulted in the death of Scientologist Lisa McPherson in 1995. Yet apologists like Shupe and Bromley never mention anything like the RPF or the other violent coercive tactics that destructive cults use against their own members, because that would interfere with their narrative about how benign and credible these groups are. So when Shupe wields this baseball bat of deprogramming, he's not wrong for calling out the small number of deprogrammers who used it, but he's also being incredibly one-sided. For an academic who's supposed to be doing objective research and reporting on these matters, this is one of his most obvious gaffes, and it is a big one.